Hello and welcome to this video on the Mutable Instruments 2020 version of Ripples, their 8HP analog multimode filter with added VCA. Let's check out what's to come in the video before we get into it. First up, I'd like to thank Mutable Instruments for sponsoring this demo video. Now, to quote the Mutable Instruments website, Ripples is a classic, big-sounding analog 4-pole filter in a small 8HP package. And over the years, it's earned its reputation as a no-fuss, elegant choice. Now, Ripples is 4-pole, as it suggests. We have low-pass, bandpass, high-pass outputs. We can switch between 4-pole and 2-pole or 24 dB and 12 dB per octave responses for the low pass and band pass. The low pass has an added level input. This is normaled high so that signals just pass through, but when you plug in, you can use envelopes and other signals or even do some AM synthesis on the low pass output only. We have two inputs. Input 2 is a nice clean pass through, and that's that classic Ripple sound, really clean, liquidy filtering. And input 2 has a ton of gain, so you can really saturate and boost and push into the filter, and there's enough gain there to bring in external signals too. We have CV over resonance that will be added to the pot, CV over frequency, which is added with this little attenuverter, full per octave tracking for a secondary frequency input. Ripples will oscillate and become an oscillator that we can FM synthesize with, AM synthesize with. It audio rate modulates really well. We can push it down into LFO ranges. There's tons of ways to use Ripples and lots of patch ideas and lots of synthesis ideas in this video that I hope you can apply in your systems too. They're on screen now, so skip around in the timing index below if you want to skip through these patches. We'll do a lot with Ripples and really push it around. And this video is really aiming to, of course, show you Ripples, but be a good tutorial on what you can do with a good multimode filter. So without further ado, let's get stuck in. So we'll of course start with some filter sweeps. We can switch from this 4-pole to a 2-pole, 12 dB per octave response. Now, input 1, drive up full, 12 dB mode, nice tubby saturated ramp or saw wave. Now bandpass. Changing the response. You can hear that tightens up. Again, we can really drive. Let's just crank the saturation. Finally, high pass. Lovely smooth high passing. But we couldn't have a filter that's tagline is liquid and not make some acid. So here I'm using ripples like a saturating, high pass, almost kind of like drum bus glue type thing. Here's my clean drum sound. Straight into 2, so no overdrive, input 2 that is, no resonance, high pass out. Get really lovely, clean and precise high passing. Before we do anything else, I'd like to look at using this like a bass boost, and you may think a high pass as a bass boost is a weird concept, but bringing the frequency up and finding these fundamentals in the kick drums. There we go, and then use the res to boost it. So we're cutting into those low frequencies with a high pass, finding the fundamentals in those tones, and cranking them. Now doing that with some drive, and because I've got 2 kicks here, listen how that low end changes as I sweep up. Now all of that was pretty extreme, generally more drive than I would tend to use, and more bass boost than I would tend to use, but bit of a low end push, bit of saturation push, and it works really well. Now here's a patch around ripples that's taming some quite aggressive digital oscillator modulation, audio rate modulation and AM synthesis, and also doing some nice low pass gate style patching. Now removing drums and effects and everything else, here's ripples output straight into my mixer. You can hear this crushed AM'd, FM'd, audio rate modulated nastiness. And Ripples does a really good job of kind of rubbery smoothing that out. Back into some reverb and some sidechain. Gives my kick. And that's low pass gate style behaviour by using an envelope to frequency and to level to couple tonal changes with amplitude changes like traditional low pass gates. Vote proctive sequence so the frequency tracks. Bit of sequencing of resonance just for some added squelch on certain steps. So here we'll take a look at audio rate modulation, frequency modulating the cutoff around a saw wave at the input. We've instantly got all those lovely vocal tones. Let's try the other outs. Here's the bandpass. Really lovely vocal throat-like tones. High pass. We'll stick with low pass and I'll change the rate of audio rate modulation. Oh, that's worked really nicely, tuning that lower. Let's try that on the bandpass. Come back up in frequency of the modulation. We've got that lovely kind of aliased top end. And all those lovely vocal, glottal, throat-like tones. So this patch is purely made to make better rings patches. I say better as in different from just triggering it as a voice like we all love to do, but using the actual input because it's a resonator, so here I'm using it as a stereo effect. And here's what's coming out of Ripples. I've split the output so we can hear it dry. So that's Ripples totally dry on its own, and here's splitting that output straight into rings. Now tuning them together, I can blend the dry sound back in. So we're listening to Ripple's output dry. That output is what is going to the input to excite rings, and the volt per octave of my original oscillator is also in rings, so they track pitch together. Now here's a quick example of AM synthesis, and as we have a VCA on board Ripples, have a sine wave coming into the input, we can hear and see the result of AM modulating the sine wave at the input with the sine wave oscillator, changing its tuning. There's some really interesting overtones to be had. And this is just sine waves. If I had richer waveforms, then that filtering would become interesting as well. Filtering the richer input wave now, and then AM modulating it. Which really does sound glorious. And that's AM synthesis using audio rate modulation to modulate level for amplitude modulation. So here I've turned Ripples into a kick drum. I'll take away everything that's going on and we'll build back up this kick drum synthesis. So that's how I would go about making a kick. Oscillating filter into a VCA, which is on board here on Ripples, level to VCA, envelope to the level of the VCA, envelope to the frequency, another tighter envelope to the frequency if we can do it. Try triggering the input at the same time. And to go that bit further, remembering that resonance is controlling our oscillation here, let's just add a random voltage to resonance. So here we'll look at pinging this filter with a short trigger to excite the filter's core. Now with no resonance, you can hear it's just kind of a trigger passing through. It's not that exciting, but as we start to add some resonance, and as we go up the spectrum, lots of clean tom-like sounds. We could use this for a melody and volt per octave sequence it. We could add, say, some audio rate modulation, which I'll do from tides right next to it. And we could start to modulate that with, say, some sample and hold to Ripples. We could have our audio rate modulation source, FMing the filter's cutoff, track that as well. There's a great range of sounds to explore. Now here I'm making a feedback loop around my effects with Ripples with its bandpass output. Now the dry sound, if I mute that in my mixer, is simply tides with some LFOs modulating wave shape into a basic VCA and envelope. Super simple, but turning my effects back on, this is routing again those effects through Ripples back into the mixer that feeds the effects, creating more feedback, and the LFO moving frequency around. Get these lovely, driven, slightly resonant bandpass feedback points. So here we're looking at Ripples as an oscillator, and it's an oscillator that we can FM and AM and amplitude control generally with envelopes as I have here. Now I have some FM coming into the frequency, an envelope to the level, and resonance up full, so this oscillates as a sine wave. and a vault per octave sequence. Now we can actually wave shape beyond this sine wave by simply feeding back an output to an input for frequency. It changes the rate, but we can shape ramps and saws. Really easily. Now adding my vault per octave sequence back in, and my envelope to level. I have a very basic sine wave synth voice, and I want to immediately get into exploring FM, and we'll add just a touch of it, and go straight in with another sine wave from another oscillator tracking the same vault per octave pitch. Let's play around with the tuning and depth of this FM. And you can hear we can tune in very musical FM. Now we could try this with AM, and for now I'll plug this into my mixer and remove my envelope that's feeding level, and we'll just try and AM modulate this as is. Some really nice AM tones. Now as this is just a normal VCA and an oscillator signal is bipolar, let's offset that slightly. Play around with the tuning of this other oscillator again. And again, there's some really musical, interesting sounds. And we could couple this with the envelope as well. So let's have a bit of offset. Just opening that level slightly, some envelope, and some AM. Play around with the tuning of this modulator again. And as this mix of offset voltage, envelope and AM kind of push into this level input, there's some interesting, quite dynamic responses. So here I've turned ripples into an LFO, and it's modulating the smoothing, the filtering or folding on tides. And this is the kind of patch we're going to work towards. But let's remove this and kind of go right back to actually turning this into an LFO. So as we've seen, if we turn the resonance up, this will oscillate with a sine wave, coming out into my scope and still modulating that smoothing. Now we can drop the rate of this with some negative voltage. So I'm going to add some negative voltage to the vault per octave in from this channel of shades. And you can see we can push this hell of a lot slower with the addition of this voltage. Now on the low pass output, we also have the level control. So using another LFO, let's control the level of the LFO. You can see now that green trace, which is the LFO of ripples modulating tides, is only active during the positive peaks of the LFO into the level. So input 1 offers enough gain to pull up external gear into Eurorack. The gain's not just there to overdrive Eurorack signals. So, as my daughter would say when she comes into this room, can we have the white synthesizer? And yes we can. Here's some Casio VL tone straight into ripples. So here I've turned ripples into a phaser. Now before we get going, this is my dry sound. So bringing that in. So split your dry sound, take one copy into a mixer, one into a bandpass filter, invert the bandpass against that dry sound and monitor or record that mixer's output. Modulating the filter, playing with resonance. There's all these really lovely, lush, liquidy phaser-like tones out of ripples. So here I wanted to use ripples for a nice big rich and slightly filthy bass sound, completing that off with a mix of oscillators at its input using the filter and VCA on the low pass mode, and then I'm sidechaining it against these drums. But here's what's happening to ripples. External sidechain against my kick, but a couple of interesting things. Envelope to VCA, simple 16th note envelope. Then we have audio rate modulation coming into the volt per octave. As well as that, I have a mix of 3 different modulation sources into the main modulation input, slightly attenuated, and that's on data there. First, the 16th note envelope that is going into the VCA. An envelope on every 3rd step. So you can mix 2 different envelopes together. And then I've got sample and hold as well, which when mixed together kind of moves this 16th note envelope around. So that's lots of modulation, pushing lots of drive and input into the thing. And that's been this video on ripples. Hit like, subscribe, support my work on patreon.com/DivKid, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.